My name is Rachel Brown, and I'm research coordinator at the CSRS. And I have the privilege of filling in for Paul today as host. So in our Scholars in the Square format, we ask speakers to present their research in 20 minutes. Then there will be a 20-minute period in which the speaker will engage in conversation with someone who knows the research field. And in this case, our interlocutor today is Dr. Shabana Xavier, who is a religious studies professor and expert in Sufism in Canada, amongst other things, at Queen's University. After Shabana and Bouchra talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a discussion period with members of the actual and virtual audience for the final 20 minutes. So our speaker today is Bouchra Mossmann, a visiting graduate student fellow this spring at the CSRS, and a PhD student at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense, sort of. Okay, sorry, I practiced, that was a hard one. Before Bouchra started her PhD in Denmark, she completed a BA in Islamic Studies at the University of Freiburg in Germany, and an MSc in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Edinburgh. At Edinburgh, she won the Yasser Suleiman Prize for the best MSc dissertation. And during these studies, she learned and/or taught Arabic in Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. In her PhD dissertation at the University of Southern Denmark, she is focusing on the lives of Muslims in the Arctic region. This is part of a larger research project coordinated by a longtime friend of the CSRS, Dr. Dietrich Jung. This project aims at understanding the lives of Muslims living as minorities in places we do not normally associate with Muslim migration. And it seems to me that the dissertation will have things to teach us about the ways that non-Muslim individuals and communities also define themselves with reference to a certain set of negotiable scripts or possibilities. And the relationship between minority and majority populations is, of course, a core interest of many people within our community at the CSRS. And so by way of a gesture in the direction of one of the most interesting sites of negotiation, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory the traditional territory of the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And so please join me in welcoming Bouchra.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, Rachel. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate each and everyone who showed up here today, either in person or via Zoom. And I want to extend my gratitude, first of all, also to the CSRS, the staff, and the scholars who I had the opportunity to meet here and on whose inspirations I still draw. And yeah, thank you for providing that space for me to kind of like organize my first impressions and findings from the first period of my fieldwork before going back to the field after I leave here in 1 week. Yeah, so making the Arctic a Muslim home, that's the title of my talk today. And I want to look at how do Muslims make places in Arctic surroundings? How do they feel home, where Islamic ritual practices are, as you might know, inter alia, severely complicated by extreme changes in daylight. Today, I will talk about mosque communities in the Canadian Arctic. The construction of 3 purpose-built mosques in northern Canada in recent years, with a 4th currently underway, reflects aspirations for rootedness, visibility, and most importantly, the desire to feel home. The mosque fulfills different functions. It provides a community home for gatherings, celebrations, educational and leisure activities, a spiritual home and a safe space for individuals, and a place of interaction with the local population. In exploring these themes, I consider the broader context of Muslim migration, community building, and placemaking in the Canadian North, and reflect on the nature of Muslim Indigenous relations briefly. The diversity amongst members of Arctic Muslim communities raises questions regarding religious authority and the interpretation of Islamic traditions across various ethnicities, generations, genders, and branches of Islam. With that stress on rural and northern lived experience of Muslims, I want to address a gap in the study of Islam in Canada and the Western Hemisphere in general. Empirically, I draw, as I just mentioned, on first impressions from fieldwork undertaken in the Northwest Territories, namely in Inuvik and Yellowknife, in the winter of 2023, and 2024, so just the past winter, and diverse media sources, as there's almost no literature on Muslim experience in the Arctic, scholarly literature. So I look at the everyday life experience and practices of self-identifying Muslim individuals and communities and the social role of the mosque in the placemaking of Muslims in Arctic communities. The notable presence of those mosques in both in media platforms mostly underscores the significance as focal points for investigation. Their existence for me accounts for Muslim populations that I can tap into to learn more about their life worlds. And we are talking about an estimated range between 150 in the smaller communities, 150 individuals, and 600 in the bigger communities like Yellowknife, for instance, in comparison to total population numbers between 3,100 and 27,000 inhabitants. So that for me highlights the potential for meaningful engagement and analysis within the context of my research objectives, which are to contribute to the comprehension of the expansive spectrum of Muslim diasporic experiences, particularly of newcomers in the Canadian Arctic, and simultaneously I contest prevailing misconceptions that depict the Arctic rather as a barren, uninhabited land awaiting exploitation, resource extraction, or being considered merely insignificant with regards to social questions of our modern world. To me, the Arctic provides an analytic prism through which I map the experience and evolution of small Muslim diasporic communities in the process of their making. And their challenges are compounded by the unique conditions of the Arctic environment. However, I also see that their implications extend far beyond this local sphere, crystallizing broader inquiries into questions of authority and the adaptive evolution of religious practices on the one hand, and social relations of diaspora context and migration on the other. So a useful point of departure for the first can be found in the history of the early Edmonton community that built Al-Rashid, Canada's first mosque, in 1938. It reveals parallels with present-day developments in Arctic Muslim communities and thereby provides an important case study of the evolutionary trajectory and institutionalization of a religious community within a distinct geographical context. And in addition, Edmonton is commonly referred to as the gate to the north. And many of the individuals living and working in Inuvik or Yellowknife that I met have familial or professional ties to the city. Relating to the second, the social aspect of how the Arctic works as an analytic prism for me lies in the investigation and understanding of the local indigenous context. So in terms of history, it prompts questions for me, such as who is included in historical narratives and whose histories are privileged. In my research in these contemporary communities, these aspects reflect in the social, political, and economic context, and I will come back to that later. First, I want to mention that most of the literature on Muslim history in Canada records settlers who arrived from Ireland and historical Bilad al-Sham, so like the Levantine, nowadays Levantine countries, towards the mid to late 19th century as the beginning of permanent Muslim presence in Canada. Some seeking for economic prosperity, others fleeing war and drafted into the army. And in many of the sources, they are referred to as pioneers, a term both used by Muslim and non-Muslim scholars. I want to add to that perspectives by both a Muslim and a Dene First Nation interlocutor that I had conversations with highlight the problematic of this term, of the term pioneers. For Muslims, the term serves as a self-description in the remembering of the Edmonton community and its significance in establishing Canada's first mosque. Like one interlocutor pointed to the wish to reclaim the term in its original meaning, for him ascribing a colonialist notion and hence avoiding it seemed as a disguise for not wanting to call anyone except white settler colonialist pioneers. Why couldn't Muslims claim a pioneering role for themselves, he said. My interlocutor from the Dene First Nation reflected on the shared trauma that colonized people had to endure and pointed to the consequences of the colonizers' hegemonic discourse in education. Indigenous people in residential schools were taught colonialist perspectives on Muslim civilizations, whereas Muslims and Arabs in the Middle East learned about indigenous people from the colonizer's perspective. And that is something that I reflected a lot in my conversations with people in Yellowknife and Inuvik. So that interlocutor actually encouraged a conversation with this reality and a discussion funded on curiosity, openness, and respect, even though we might not always have accurate words and vocabulary, as she said. So the narrative of the Edmonton pioneers, for me, mirrors the prevailing historiography concerning Muslim presence in Canada, which often overlooks the fact that while their stories may have rarely made it into historical records, as we know so far, or the broader historiography of Canada, Muslim individuals did arrive in this part of the North American continent much earlier. And nevertheless, the historical narrative of the Al-Rashid Mosque, as I mentioned, and its community in Edmonton provides for me a valuable contextual framework for examining contemporary patterns of community organization, mosque construction, fundraising strategies, and the incremental expansion and diversification of present-day Arctic Muslim communities. Many early Muslim immigrants from the Levant, as I mentioned before, were engaging in trades such as trapping and paddling. They opened up small businesses. They frequently passed through Edmonton on their way to northern regions, where some settled and founded enduring Muslim communities in places like Lac La Biche or Fort McMurray that we can still see today. Chain migration processes contributed to the growing Muslim population in Canada, and encouraged by relatives and friends, many were attracted to Edmonton because it has promising business opportunities, educational resources, and a developing Arab Muslim social community with their leaders. So in the 1930s, the need for a space to gather as a group for occasions grew, and with it, the idea to build such a community space, not only to worship, but just like to root the Muslim group in the local social fabric. And in its early days, the mosque's basement served as a community space for social events and celebrations. And over the decades, Al-Rashid's community grew with many Muslim immigrants to Canada, and the multifaceted engagement of this community that continues until today reflects in the words of mosque president Khalid Tarabain that I just want to cite. He says the mosque is not only a place of worship, it's a cultural place to connect with other communities. It's an identity, it's a feeling and being good as a Muslim and as a Canadian and participating in society. And my interviews with members of the Muslim community in Inuvik and statements from a documentary film that was made by two sisters from Winnipeg accompanying the construction of the Midnight Sun Mosque in Inuvik echo this strive for a sense of permanence and belonging, which is not only tied to the creation of a sacred space, but closely related to the social roles that the mosque fulfills, as it provides Muslims with a space together to retreat as spiritual and collective home amidst life challenges. In the case of the Midnight Sun Mosque, the concept home takes on a literal meaning. Due to financial constraints, the most feasible option for the community was to acquire a prefab home from Winnipeg and transport it to Inuvik by truck and barge. Upon its arrival, the mosque was adorned with a minaret on the exterior and furnished with the minbar carpets and Islamic decorations on the interior. The Midnight Sun Mosque in Inuvik was the first of, as I said before, 3 purpose-built mosques that have been established in the Canadian Arctic in recent years. After it was inaugurated in 2010 as the most northern mosque that it is still in the Western Hemisphere. Nunavut's mosque followed in Iqaluit in 2016 and Yukon's mosque in Whitehorse in 2018. And the Islamic Center in Yellowknife is still under construction after several delays, as you can see. That was in November 2023, and it should hopefully be completed by the end of this year. At first, the small number of Muslims in these distant northern areas gathered for prayers in informal settings like private homes, rented trailers, or sometimes even in local churches or community halls. But as the community grew, so did the aspiration for purpose-built mosques where everyone could come together. So the first mosque in Inuvik, that again you can see the Midnight Sun Mosque, arrived towards like the late 1980s and the early 1990s. They were from places such as Sudan, Lebanon, Palestine, Somalia, and Egypt. And with the increasing number of community members, they had a small trailer that they purchased in the late 1990s as a first musalla, or like prayer room, and that soon outgrew their needs and strengthened the wish for a purpose-built mosque. So they raised funds, but despite the impressive funds among the 100 community members that the community had at that time, you can imagine it's still very hard to purchase a proper, or to build a proper mosque. So the Winnipeg-based Zubaydah Al-Talab Foundation offered fundraising support, and they are kind of like funded even from overseas, from countries in the Gulf especially, and local fundraising efforts. So in the fall of 2010, the Midnight Sun Mosque made its way from Winnipeg by truck about 2,500 kilometers north to Hay River, and then another almost 2,000 kilometers up the river to Inuvik. And that came out cheaper than having the mosque built locally. Other northern communities followed suit, and subsequently the mosques in Iqaluit and Whitehorse, both serving congregations of about 100 to 150 members, were built, starting as community-led initiatives and supported by government grants, and again the Zubaydah Talab Foundation. After several delays, Yellowknife's new Islamic Center for the about 600 community members will include, when it's finished, spaces for youth sport, family get-togethers and celebrations, religious education, and other community services. That will be like a real center, not necessarily only a mosque. These spaces have even higher importance in winter, when public space is extremely limited in these small communities, and the mosques mentioned not only like include these want to include these spaces, but also engage regularly in community outreach projects. Okay, I will skip some of that because I want to, 5 minutes only. I'm so sorry. Okay.
Sorry.
I'm really sorry, honestly, because I read that anyway, I will continue because what I wanted to say with all that is what you can see is these communities developed kind of like gradually, as we saw for the Edmonton community, and this gradual institutionalization comes along with other needs than just building a place of worship. And what I want to come to now, what is the most important, is actually the challenges that these communities face by establishing a mosque, a congregation, because, yeah, obviously Arctic Muslim communities face the question of how to determine the daily duration of their fast and the times for their 5 daily prayers, especially in the extreme situation when Ramadan coincides with the height of summer or winter. And then the diversity that we have in terms of ethnics, linguistic backgrounds, etc., complicate this situation. So in Inuvik, there were different practices at the time. Some who had been staying there for a long time, others had followed the times, like they had followed the times of Edmonton or Winnipeg in terms of like following the closest town that has a full sunset and sunrise. But that, like, there were a lot of different practices. Others would just follow local times, which meant 22 hours of local daylight and fast. And that made it really difficult to bring them together as a community. So in the end, they chose community consensus over those differing individual practices, at least in Inuvik, and they decided to adopt a fatwa that told them they can go by Mecca times. So they can just actually break their fast earlier than some of the more southern towns or cities in Canada. In Yellowknife, reaching this consensus is still an issue. There's a lot of different practices, and what I discovered when I was there, mostly interlocutors told me that the absence of a mosque made it much more difficult to unify the community in that sense, even though they have a temporary prayer room that follows, interestingly, Mecca times during the summer and local times throughout the rest of the year. Other challenges that we can talk about are informed by, as I said before, like these ties that people maintain to places further south in terms of educational opportunities. Healthcare is a very important factor, and sourcing halal foods. which obviously is a big challenge up north. And yeah, and I was looking also at aspects of mosque design and governance in terms of like how are these spaces, like what ideas went into a discussion on the architecture of the mosque, because as you could see, there's a lot of aspects guided by financial interests or financial practicalities, but then on the other hand also like what do the women's spaces look like, and how does that correlate with how women are engaged in mosque activities in general. And I mean, what I want to like essentially also highlight as significant aspects of the context that contribute, like the specific Arctic context, are, as I said before, like Muslim indigenous relations and the general idea of how newcomers are received in these places. And yeah, there are social aspects of attraction for newcomers. Like I was looking at why do they come to the north and what do they do there, which is basically most of them like come for economic incentives, government jobs, also leaving university degrees behind and establishing businesses, self-employed businesses that are often very lucrative, and many of these families count themselves amongst the most wealthy families in those communities. But then also like how does that play together with the socio-economic and political situation of the indigenous context that is there. And there I just wanted to remember like how my interlocutors emphasized shared values in terms of they refer to aspects such as respect for the elders, family life, and a shared history of suffering, as we could see before. And generally, there's a lot of understanding for the situation of indigenous folks and their history. Although most of them said that they had not known about the situation before they came to those places. And another challenge that made it very obvious in terms of like a complication of placemaking or even a prevention of it in terms of it implies a temporal absence of home was the evacuation due to the wildfires last summer that lasted almost a month. And while like some of them actually referred to it as an evacation in terms of like folks were happy about the additional holidays and that they could make use of leisure activities that they were offered in the cities that they evacuated to, such as Edmonton or Calgary. Many others were really struggling to make ends meet, and this crisis basically crystallized a lot of social and economic realities that we would need to look at. So with that, I would end, and I'm very sorry because I have too much to talk about.
Great. Thank you. We can get to more of the details with Dr. Shabana Xavier now. So I will allow you two to converse. Congratulations. Oh, am I okay? Yeah.
Actually, if everyone could just shift, you're a little bit out of screen, Rachel, for that Zoom on.
No? Okay, perfect. Congratulations. How are you feeling? Good. Okay. I'm really happy to be in conversation with you about this. I've also enjoyed our conversation over the month of all the particularities. So I may be speaking to some bigger components of the project that we haven't heard about, which is great. Yeah. I will say as an introduction, I'm very inspired by your project. And I think you're doing really important work in terms of thinking about Islam in Canada. This is novel, innovative. And I say that particularly because Islam in Canada is so inundated with generalities. And I think what you're doing is really starting to get us and scholars to think about these fields in very regional specific ways that can bring granular details. And I think historically there's been a tendency to think so broad scope, east to west, north to south, but what's happening in the Atlantic coast, for instance, is so different from what's happening in the Arctic to what's happening in BC. And so I think scholarship like what you're doing and other grad students are doing is so important to push the field. And so I thank you for that. And I'm really glad to be in conversation and to see you at this phase as well. It's an honor for me.
So having said that, let's talk about some of the particularities. One of the things that I picked up today in your conversation was this idea of the pioneer. And we were just talking about it on the walk over, and we had a lot of thoughts about it. I want to complicate it a little bit even more. Because if we start talking about the story of Islam in Canada from the Atlantic coast, it's maritime provinces or Southern Ontario, I often tell my students to think about that the first Muslims were Black, right? Those who were enslaved and who were either escaping from the US in various contexts. And so there's lots of interesting migration patterns in Southern Ontario, Amherstburg and all that. And in Halifax, or in Truro, just outside Halifax, is one of the oldest Muslim cemeteries in Canada. So we're thinking about space, and you're guiding us through mosque spaces. I wonder what it means that like one of the oldest Muslim claimed cemeteries is in the Atlantic province. And having walked through that cemetery, it's quite really intense to think about, well, who are these individuals who are buried there? What are their stories? So how does that, let's unpack this pioneer issue and then add this other issue of the enslaved and the nameless, right? And how is that pushing us a little bit more to decolonize the field, really, is what I heard. But I could have misunderstood kind of what you were trying to get us to think about. So does that complicate it a bit more? Is that maybe in alignment with what you're trying to get us to do, which is move away from the pioneer model? Is there another approach maybe? Because it doesn't seem like it's working, right?
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting to see. That's why I asked, who were the first Muslims in Canada, and is that really important to look at in terms of do we really have to? Is it important to claim that role for someone, or is it rather important to acknowledge that the start of Muslim history in Canada is kind of fringy, and do we kind of should we rather acknowledge that, as I said before, and as you said now, that most of these narratives are just invisible in the historiography, and we can't do anything about it in terms of we can't find out if nothing has been recorded, but we can try to think that with what we do. And what I found just really interesting is that aspect that I mentioned of my interlocutor, who said that the consciousness of us, of Muslim newcomers who come to these places, or of anyone who's kind of involved in these Muslim indigenous contexts, that consciousness was also guided by hegemonic narratives, and that I think is important to see, and in terms of how do we look at these things, and how do we take the narratives that we get.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this also happened in thinking about Islam in the United States as well. And there's a lot of tendency to think about it as pioneers who came and tilled the land and set up the farms and did the homesteads.
And that is a reality we have to acknowledge as well. With those Muslims who established themselves in Edmonton, they were part of that settler colonialist context.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think pushing the narrative back even further by taking an Atlantic historical approach or Southern Ontario historical approach also challenges that narrative that we get so caught up in the pioneer narrative or the first narrative. And I think it's important to conjecture and maybe even fabulate those archival narratives, because we don't have the details. And if we can, try to fill it in. But I think getting bogged down is also really interesting. But I think with a lot of migrant communities being the first, especially to establish something, there is a colonial mindset as well that we need to interrogate.
But there, I think one thing I can add to that is that I was talking with people in Yellowknife and Inuvik, if they were aware of one of those first Muslims from the Edmonton community who came up north, who operated trading posts close to Yellowknife, and who later became a member of the Legislative Council, the pre-version of the Legislative Assembly in the 60s, and who, within his own framework, I guess, tried to advocate for Indigenous rights. But none of my interlocutors were really aware of this story. So me doing that research and telling them was kind of oh, now we learn about this. And then I want to acknowledge that I don't think that nowadays communities that I talk about do see themselves within a kind of pioneering role in that sense, or within an idea of advancing Muslim settlement or anything in that sense.
Yeah.
And I think that is also important to note.
Right, right. No, that's great. And I think it's unfolding in the Arctic context in your field sites in really
Yeah,
interesting ways that it's
exactly,
evoking the past.
because it awakes a consciousness that hasn't been there before, because it awakes many people who say like, we didn't learn about this before we came to this context, but now we live together and we build community together. And to see that, like one of the impressions I got when I was up there was also, it doesn't really matter in what, like with what background you come to the community. It matters more what you bring to the community in terms of values. How do you treat other people, rather than thinking about a financial background or a professional background, or any kind of like these socio-economic realities. I mean, they reflect, and on the other hand, they are not made as big, I guess, but those are personal impressions, I would say, like nothing. Yeah,
that's great. Let's pivot to space, and I love thinking about space as well, and kind of the images that you've shown us have really been helpful. I want to ask about, so often when we think about migrant communities going to new places and trying to replicate spaces from their homeland, natal context, they have this kind of nostalgia and like attempt to replicate architecture in very specific ways. But as you kind of indicated, there's just the realities of like local resources and access and all of this stuff. Can you say a little bit more about how maybe the mosques in the Arctic are being vernacularized or localized? And I mean, the heat issue seems to be one that was kind of coming up, and the delivery issue of bringing things from other places. And I love that image of on the boat, like that's pretty profound in many ways. But what other like aspects? I mean, architecture, you talked a little bit about how the community, the mosque that is going to be, that is in production now or being built now, has all these other components and subspaces. But about architecture, like, do you see things that are different? And you have lots of experience traveling different parts of the world and having seen different mosques. So are there things that stand up for you as like, oh, this seems uniquely an Arctic mosque as opposed to something that you might see in, I don't know, in Turkey or in India or somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like the interior, and there again, it's a practical decision. If we talk about the case in Inuvik, they decided we want to have a mosque and we want to have it quick, kind of like what are the possibilities to get that? Whereas I think in Yellowknife, one of the reasons why the construction has been delayed so many times is that decisions about the lot where to build it, and the price for that lot, and decisions about what to include into this complex and the price of that are like constantly negotiated and therefore kind of delayed. And I think those are just two different pathways to go about it. In terms of the architecture, I would say the interior is, I mean, held as much, like, I mean, there is definitely always elements that you would find, like carpeted floors, trying to find like Islamic calligraphy, ornaments, things like that, and that you can definitely see. But then in the Inuvik Mosque, they also have a very beautiful, like embroidered, I think I'm not sure if like I don't remember if it says salam or like some word in Arabic that was embroidered by an non-native, non-Arabic speaker of the community, like a local. So they definitely include elements of of their local context as well. And I would say the way the mosque in Inuvik is built, and maybe also the one in Iqaluit, is definitely blending in with the houses that you would find there.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting.
But it's interesting to look at, as I said, like that the minaret was added locally by someone.
From this image.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I mean, the minaret and the minbar and all these, and the what it's called, like the thing up there. Like the thing on the roof was all these
The dome?
elements, the dome, the dome, they were added locally.
And
Once,
sorry, just quickly related to this question, because I'm super fascinated by it. You mentioned the kind of fundraising for the various mosques because they only have 100 people. So then funds came in from other
exactly,
places.
yeah, and that
So
is
is that represented in any of these mosques, the funds that came from other places?
I mean, yes, you would see like that green sign on the side of the minbar. It says Midnight Sun Mosque in Uvik, a project by Zubaydah Talab Foundation. So you can see that definitely. But other than that, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think there's a lot of consultation processes that have been made with the funding sponsors about like how to transport, how to like what is the design that is most feasible for the funds that are there and how to transport and all these kinds of things.
And it's also like, because it's purposeful, in a lot of instances, mosque communities take over emptied other spaces and often churches. And so there's like a layering of history, of architectural history, but the idea that it's purposeful, and then you've indicated that it needed to blend in. So now I'm seeing other things. And I've also never seen a minaret like kind of aside of the mosque. I often seen it at the top, kind of indicating this is where a mosque is. And even in the most concentrated places, like if you go to Cairo, you'll just see kind of a horizon of minarets, right? So I wonder if there's like the realities of why that needed to be placed where it needed to be placed, right? And of course, I think the snow also just adds another dimension to it. Another thing I want to ask you about is women. Mosque spaces are complicated, right? They're really complicated spaces. They're complicated when it comes to gender. And I'm curious, because one of the things we could do is that we kind of take the official approach to studying lived realities of religion. We could go to the churches or the temples and the mosques and say, well, how are these representative of the religion? And sometimes that has like kind of a particular orthodoxy or whatnot to it. And religious studies scholars do this all the time. It's the reality. But we also need to not assume that this is the only way of like piety, right? And this is where it becomes important, especially in terms of accessibility issues, folks who are maybe queer and can't have access to these issues, and then women, right? So when I think about mosque spaces, I think about here's a particular normativity, but I often think about, oh, who's not here?
Yeah.
Right. And so you kind of hinted at women, and maybe you wanted to talk about it more in your presentation, but didn't get a chance to. Are there women sections? If there are they behind the men? Are they in the basement? Hopefully not in a closet. Is that a reality? Are women gathering in their own parallel spaces? And what does that look like? Yeah.
So in Inuvik, there is a separate women's section that is kind of like a corner of the main prayer space, and it's connected by a window that can be closed with curtains, which has a different, like a separate sound system. While I was there, I didn't encounter Muslim women in the mosque. Mostly they told me they had work commitments and they kind of like they were in other places. Some of them were further down south with their children who went to university. Many of the families are actually kind of like separated in the sense of that the men work up north, but they sustain their families in different places. And so I couldn't say anything about the interaction like of women in the mosque. And I've seen videos of like the recent Ramadan celebrations where they would send food, but they would probably also gather rather separately because they weren't really visible in any of the video recordings of the main prayer space. And in Yellowknife, we can't really say anything for the moment because that temporary musalla doesn't really include a place for women. And I was told that they wouldn't really go there because it is just a very small space in a converted warehouse. It's not a place where it would be comfortable for them to be, I guess. I think it's definitely important to look at other spaces for women in terms of their religious practice and to acknowledge that it is maybe even historically, like a component that like how are women represented in a mosque, and how connected do they feel to that, and in wanting to join. Yeah.
And I think with the Al Rashid Mosque, or when he wrote his book, he said most of the people who initiated the building of it were women, right? And so it's kind of interesting to think about if this is a male-dominated kind of construction projects or institutionalization project, what that means. Are we?
I think you got
That's
one more
question.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I'll ask you. Okay, let me ask you the fieldwork question. So we've been talking a lot, and I super appreciate also, like, I just can imagine all the levels of challenges of doing fieldwork in a place like this. And I know people in this room do fieldwork in like complicated political spaces and all of this stuff, and it's not easy in any way. And we've had some conversation about just like the technical issue, you know what I mean? Like the technicality of a thing, the fact that it's remote, the fact that, I'm just kind of, what are some like technical issues that you've had in terms of fieldwork? Not things about positionality or kind of personal relationships or anything like that, but just purely like, I mean, has your recorder run out of battery because it's been so cold? Like, you know what I mean? Like stuff like that. Like, how do you even get to this place? I mean, is there public transport? Or, I don't think there's Uber. Like, maybe I'm making ignorant assumptions, but like, how are you doing this?
That's actually like a funny part about the Uber thing is, in Yellowknife, I thought there were buses, but it's basically like just 2 bus lines that run. I could have just walked. So basically I ended up walking everywhere. And in Yellowknife, it wasn't that bad yet. It was kind of like around -20.
Oh my gosh.
But it was funny because I like how people reacted to me walking, because I really just walked everywhere. And in the end, like, I mean, I would even turn down an offer for a lift because I enjoyed the walking. Actually, I ended up enjoying it. And that helped me process my thoughts, going from site to site, going from interview to interview, things like that. So, I mean, it was a very important aspect of like technical challenges. But yeah, you have to have the gear to walk outside. And that was something, I mean, I did some kind of preparation in learning about the appropriate gear, about like, when do you actually get frostbite, and like what should you do, or I mean things that because for me it was completely new, and things that I guess were just important to consider beforehand. And as you said, like I got a phone that has battery, or kind of like that said it would react to cold temperatures by still functioning and things like that. So but in the end, I don't think that those temperatures in a way were an obstacle to my fieldwork. I think more so were the finances, because the housing, we all know how the housing crisis affects us here, and that is even more dire up there, and not only in terms of prices, but just in terms of that there isn't enough housing simply. Homelessness is a big issue, and the thought of like how to contribute to that. So I was lucky enough to be in places that other people kind of like the places belonged to them, but they were gone for some time, so I could fill in as an interim
house sitting.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that made sense to me, but it's definitely important to look at that. And another thing to think about if you go to the north are research licenses.
Yes.
And that is something that just takes a lot of time, and it's important to think that with the fieldwork. So in terms of the wildfires, that complicated the whole time frame, because in the summer people were out on the land, then the wildfire happened, the evacuation happened. So for me to get to the right address to actually obtain that license and to discuss what they needed and all that, it took me several months. And that is something that, I mean, contains unforeseeable circumstances and things that come in the way that are important to keep in mind.
Yeah. That's intense. Yeah. And I'll say one of the things I appreciated, I mean, beyond the ethical issues, was that you said that when you were walking a lot, if you were, because, you know, we all at the end of field work have to go home and write notes. And you had given me the pointer that, well, sometimes when I was walking, I would just record my notes on the audio so that I didn't feel pressured. You didn't feel pressured to have to go home and then have to write an entire field entry at the end of it. And so that has been something that I've been trying to keep in mind for my own field work. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. What a great conversation. So now we can open it up to a broader conversation with folks on Zoom and in the room. And so I see Francis is eager to ask the first one, so we'll go there.
Yeah, lots of questions, and I won't be able to come tomorrow, so I'd love to have a conversation. A couple of things. First of all, I think the first Muslim person to go to the north was about the early 1910s. Great grandfather of Aaron Hughes, a friend of ours, friend of the centre. His name was Peter. He was a fur trader.
Peter Baker.
Yeah, Peter Baker.
I was
That's it.
talking
And
about
I wondered how he got on with the Jewish fur traders who were going up north at the same time, and very much involved with Aboriginal culture. Second thing is, I was on a selection committee for several years for an Islamic communities chair at the University of Alberta, which never actually really succeeded. And the communities chair was funded by the local Lebanese community, largely Lebanese, which was well established in Canada, involved with politics and everything, but was scared to death of recent immigrants, and especially of the influence of radical Islam, and the influence of Saudi trained imams who had a very sort of narrow perspective and wanted to kind of have a kind of bulwark against it. I was wondering about how in the north tensions played out, if there were tensions between the different communities, different Islamic communities, Sunni and Shia, but especially Ismaili, and also between old guard Muslims, from Bangladesh and the newer communities.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll
and
answer.
there's much more to ask.
Yeah, that first question, second question actually first, about tensions. What I discovered, or like what I could hear from my interlocutors, that there is, I mean, like an Ahmadiyya movement who would try to organize events in those places. So they would have an event at the Midnight Sun complex in Inuvik talking about Ask Me Anything About Islam. And that was something that the local community wouldn't engage with, because that is, like that these two things would be completely separate. And in Yellowknife, apparently there is, at least if you Google it, you would find a Shia mosque, and they have a website. I was told that it's one family. I'm not sure about that yet, because I haven't had the chance to get in touch with them yet, but I would very much love to do so, to find more, find out more. The mosques the mosque communities that I visited mostly, I mean, include Sunni tradition, according to any, I would say, like local flavor. As I said, ethnicities are like, the diversity is very broad, but that doesn't mean that they can have the same prayer practice when it comes to that, or it just kind of like orientates at the community member that is taking up the prayer service, that is like functioning as an imam. They don't have a funded imam in Inuvik. They have one in Yellowknife, which means that in Inuvik it's mostly the community elders who would take up on that role. And as for your first question, Peter Baker, I mean, the memoirs he's written, he mentions a couple of times that he was considered a Jew himself by many people. They would just call him the Black Jew or things like that. So, but he never really mentioned anything about the people he he would work with. He wouldn't even like include in his memoirs any reflections on his own religious practice. So he would mostly just mention people by their name and then tell the geographical location, like where they were located in terms of the routes for his trading posts that he did by dog team, and then how he stayed at their house or not. Like, yeah.
You know that you know Aaron Hughes is writing a history of Muslim.
Yeah.
Do we have any Zoom questions? Yeah, Paul.
Yep, Jen Selby, who you know very well, is with us today virtually from Finland. She asks, she says, Bouchra, it's wonderful to hear you today. I wondered if you could tell us more about the Muslims who live in field sites and how the Arctic remote geography influences who stays long term in terms of their generation, especially in what that might mean for the community. Because it's one thing to root in Edmonton or Toronto and say, this is where we live now, and that's great, we're going to build our institutions. But if people are kind of just passing through, what does that do to the communities?
Yeah, that is really an important and interesting aspect, because basically the interlocutors that I conversed with were all like first generation Muslim migrants to Canada that might have been in other places previously to like coming to the north, but who were not born in Canada. Whereas the next generation, now their children, mostly left for education, and there's not so many of them coming back and taking up work in the north, at least for now. That is something to see, because I mean, it's also like a generation that is still growing, and the idea of fluctuation or like transient communities is really important, especially in Yellowknife. There's a lot of, not only with newcomers, Muslims, but just in general population that is coming and going kind of like very easily, very quickly. And then there's a high turnover of tourists that makes it, makes many people say that it is in that sense, a very transient idea of community. And that definitely complicates questions of, like how to manage prayer times. Is it necessary that we agree on one practice or not? Is it like, are these things necessary? And I think they complicate that. But then you can also see that there's probably a core of a couple of families who have stayed there for decades and who assume that function as community, like as leading figures, maybe not officially, but at least within the community, and that certainly influences the way the community is built. And they assume the role of also someone welcoming new members.
Just to tease out Jen's question, if that's okay.
Sure.
I mean, so I wonder, when you think about the different sites you're thinking about, how would you explain why some communities might be much more committed to sticking around, to like building communities, institutions, and others might just accept the transients?
I mean, I
like, is it just
don't
size?
have a definite answer to that, because as I said, like I'm talking about first impressions from my fieldwork. I haven't completed that yet. But what I would say is definitely Yellowknife is the capital. It's a city of only 20,000 inhabitants, but it is a capital city, and that of course makes the turnover much more in terms of job postings and these things. Whereas I guess in a community like Inuvik, where so many people are working self-employed, have established businesses, if you have established a business and you have a local group of customers, I think it's much harder to transition to another city or another place, and that makes it much more probable that parts of the family might migrate further down south, because there is more opportunities, as I said, for healthcare, education, and more, comfort in terms of lifestyle, but the businesses are established and they are still there.
I'm wondering if I could somewhat tie Jen's question with Francis's just a little bit, in terms of hearing your reflections on maybe what's unique about the sort of minority Muslim experience in the Arctic in comparison to other places and spaces where you might only have 600 folks in a community of, a city of 1 million or whatever, so quite small. And oftentimes we see in lots of other folks' work and studies that the mosque is quite diverse because it's the only space that you have, and everybody kind of works together. And so there's a real flexibility there. But then as soon as the community kind of grows enough, then you start to see some of the splitting off of different ethnic kind of backgrounds and approaches, schools of law and that sort of thing. But what's interesting is maybe in the Arctic, if you have all this turnover all the time, there's almost like a constant inbuilt setting up of that sort of welcomeness of all this diversity, because it's never going to kind of get to the saturation point where it's big enough to split off. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think actually, like, I mean, one thing that is contrary to that, I would say, is that I observed in Yellowknife, many people mourned that there is no mosque in place yet. And since it's taken so long to build it, there were several years where some would tell me, like, the only time I meet other women, for instance, is at the Palestine protest, or is at, you know, a potluck that we organize privately between our friends, and those friend groups would be rather orientated, I guess, along language lines mostly, sometimes ethnic lines as well. So that I observe this beginning fragmentation there already, but at the same time, it's a very interesting thought to look at, like, how does this, like, the fluctuation actually affect the way of how new community members are welcomed, or if that is, yeah, in what ways.
I'd be curious to see how that.
It's also
Works out.
generational, I imagine, right? Like you're saying that this is first gen, like if you were to categorize them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I imagine that would be like a longer study, because I think if you do the Al Rashid Mosque, any places, the first gen often has this intention and goal of just even getting a space.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think first gen immigrants generally have a different mode or intent or purpose, is that they often are arriving and thinking about survival.
Yeah.
And you see this with a lot of second gen and children of immigrants often, is that their intentions are different, because that survival
Exactly.
mode has been allowed, and now they have other goals.
And also, especially also, like, the parents might wish for their children to go to university, and you can only go to university if you move south.
Yeah.
And what does that make with you if you live several years further down south? Do you really want to come back to that Arctic environment? So I think there's a lot of like interesting parts to that, in seeing if, like, the next generation will actually stay there or return there, or rather,
Or if there will be a next generation, from Jen's small question and Rachel's point, is
Yeah.
like, if it's the transient nomadic revolving door mentality, is there even capacity at an institutional level to generationally build up in
Yeah.
a space
Yeah.
to get to those kind of issues that you're pointing out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. I see Mehrun's hand, and then do we have another student? Okay, so Mehrun first.
Bouchra, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful. And I appreciate what Shoban and Francis said. I think those complexities are really important to discuss. I just wonder about, with your research, like, thinking about the fluctuation of people coming and going. You mentioned briefly about migration. I do wonder about, did you look at immigration patterns? Like, I wonder about the early immigrants who went there, and why did they go there? Was it because they couldn't go to anywhere else in Canada? What was the policy history at that time? And then versus now, like, the people who are going there, is it because that's where they can only get jobs versus in other metropolitan areas? Like, is there some kind of racism aspect going on around the policy side, where people are ending up in the Arctic, that's where they can only go? Like, so I'm thinking about the pattern of immigration, what made folks go there into that part, and then thinking about the younger people who are leaving. Maybe there might be another number of social factors there that. So I'm curious if you looked at immigration policy and the history of migration in that regard, and to now.
Yeah, like, what now definitely certainly plays a role are provincial nominee programs,
Yes.
and are, like, is the motivation that, like, to get PR much more easily in the north, much more quicker mostly, and have the chance to bring family also quicker. Apart from that, many are employed by the government, especially in Yellowknife. So there's just a lot of lucrative jobs, a lot of good economic incentives, and as I said, like prospects of wealth that you would probably not find in this ratio anywhere else in Canada, which makes it definitely kind of like, yeah, a reason to migrate. I think that was actually similar to the first Muslims who came were mostly attracted, like not the first that we had that discussion before, but the first that I'm talking about from the Edmonton community, they were attracted by the gold rush. Then to find out that the gold rush had already happened and they had to find other opportunities to work, and like these economic interests were definitely one of the biggest reasons. And after that, chain migration processes that took place and that invited families and friends and kind of like made these communities grow. And then certainly, of course, refugee movements, but those were to Canada in general. Like they weren't so specific to the north, I would say. So like the Arctic in that sense, I think was really most importantly as an economic reason.
Thanks. So Paul, do you have a quick question or should we? Okay, I
No,
think
but-
we need to wrap up because we're at
those are
time,
just
unfortunately.
Pictures.
But I do want to draw your attention to next week's lecture and to note that it is a special day, that it is Tuesday instead of our regular Thursday. So please join us here, same time, same place, but different day, to hear from Elliot on the struggle for a godless Canada. And please join me in thanking Bouchra and Bouchra.